Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. I produce these videos weekly for a twofold purpose. The first of which is to help move my brain out of thinking mode, or what I, as a coffee drinker, call a percolation mode, as I'm pondering and thinking on the text for the week. And I move into what I call sermonation mode because it rhymes. As I'm actually preparing and writing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation on Sunday. The second reason for these videos is, of course, to allow you, the viewer, who have stumbled across this video for whatever reason, to just gain some different insight and ideas into the assigned gospel text for the week. That being said, I record this on today, which is Friday, September 11th, 2015. And we remember, of course, the terrible tragedy that happened 14 years ago with the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in New York and in Washington. That being said, the gospel text for this coming Sunday, which is September 13th, 2015, the 16th Sunday after Pentecost, which also in many places will likely be Rally Sunday as congregations ramp up and kick off their program year here on the first Sunday following Labor Day, which was, of course, last Monday. So if it's Rally Day for your congregation, happy Rally Day, and may God bless this new program year that's kicking off. And if it's not Rally Day for you, well then disregard what I've just said. Anyway, coming back around, the gospel lesson for this Sunday is Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. Now some background to where we are at. We now find ourselves halfway through Mark's gospel, 16 chapters, and we've now we're into chapter 8. So we're halfway through, and it's at this point that many scholars think that Jesus turns his face towards Jerusalem, that there's been the ministry side of things, and now we are looking towards Jerusalem, and actually just a couple more chapters, then Jesus will arrive in Jerusalem, and then the remainder of the gospel is that final week leading up to the crucifixion and then the resurrection. So that's kind of some background to that, and we've been seeing Jesus do a lot of different things. If you've tuned in the last couple of weeks, Jesus has been kind of shifting his focus from his ministry occurring in Jewish areas now into some more Gentile areas. So a lot of different explanations for why that's happening, some of which is just he's angered the religious leaders enough that he needs to remain kind of out of their realm of influence, because things could go dangerous for him. That's one reason. Others talk about his focus shifting from not only the lost sheep of Israel, as he says, but now as the kingdom of heaven comes for the entire world, we see some of that as well. But regardless of that, he's now been active in Gentile regions and kind of doing a lot of the very same stuff that he has done previously. We see a repeat, almost a repeat miracle in the feeding of the 4,000. Very, very similar to the feeding of the 5,000. Some scholars even think that this is just a different account of the same story. But that's happened. There's been healings. There's been exorcisms of demons and evil spirits. And so all of this stuff has kind of been going on leading up to this point. So now we hear Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on his way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Okay, that's the first portion, and I'm going to pause for a moment there. Now, we've got some interesting little points that are worth noting. Being in the region of Caesarea Philippi, there's a lot of interesting things about that. Now, Caesarea was actually kind of a common name. It's after Caesar, so this is calling a region or an area or a city. Caesarea is in honor of Caesar, so it's giving homage to the Romans. And then to say Philippi, that's named after Philip, who is the brother King Herod, the son of one of the sons of King Herod the Great. So this whole area is kind of named after two people who probably don't really like Jesus very much, at least if they're aware of him. Caesar probably isn't, but Philip may be. And interestingly enough, as Jesus asks this, who do the people say that I am? They rattle off some possibilities. Some say John the Baptist, ironic, because John the Baptist was, of course, killed for speaking out against Philip's brother, Herod. So that's interesting. And then we hear Elijah or one of the prophets. So these religious figures who are prominent within the history of Israel, the history of the Jewish culture. Some people speculate he's one of those. Some think he's John, and Jesus is bold. Jesus speaks about a new way of thinking, religiously speaking, of course, and has a following. John also had a following. So in a day where there were no newspapers and there was no internet and there was no TV, perhaps you hear about a religious man out in the countryside drawing a crowd, and you could easily mix the two up. So that kind of makes sense. Calling him Elijah as a prophet did much of the same thing. Of course, that was way before. But then one of the prophets, a holy man who comes from God, who can heal and proclaiming the word of God, that's a prophet. That's what they do. So these names that are given for him, or these identities, are not unexpected. But interestingly enough, then Jesus turns the tables and says, okay, that's who the people say that I am, but you guys have been with me. Who do you say that I am? Jesus addresses that important question in our lives of faith. Who do you, the individual, say that I am? But he is addressing them all. It's plural as he says it. Who y'all say that I am? But asking them, due to your experience, who do you say that I am? And Peter answers for the first time in Mark's gospel. Someone calls Jesus the Messiah, or Christos is the Greek word, the Christ. So this is significant. It's for the first time that he is identified as this. Now, through Mark's gospel, the narration kind of gives us some of that name. There are definitely hints at it there. So we, the readers, have this, but the disciples don't. You got to remember that for them, they're experiencing this. They don't have the whole story yet. So that's something interesting to know. But once again, after Peter makes this wonderful statement, we have what's called the messianic secret in Mark's gospel, and Jesus says, "Yes, don't tell anyone." I don't know why that is. And on a personal note, I often struggle with that. Why does Jesus do that? Why does he limit them? You would think that Jesus would want that proclaimed from the rooftops, but for whatever reason, he hushes them. So you got me. If you've got ideas, please share them down in the comments and let me know why that is. Moving on. Now that Jesus has been identified by these men, he teaches them. And he says, then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all of this quite openly. Now that's interesting. As he says this openly, he's not just speaking it in secret to the disciples, but it seems that he's talking about this probably more than just once. As he talks about it openly, he shares with them this stuff is going to happen. And then we hear the rebuke coming from Peter that I'll get to in just a moment. And perhaps that's not unexpected. He's like, Jesus, be quiet. You're giving them ideas. They're going to try and kill you because they don't like you. But for them to see Jesus is teaching them, yes, I am the Messiah, and this is what that means. It just blows their minds, because for them, the Messiah is an anointed leader, an anointed king, oftentimes, like David and King Saul. They were messiahs because they were anointed. That's what Messiah means. But of course, Jesus is something completely different. Okay, moving on. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, but turning and looking at his disciples, so all of them, not just Peter, but they all hear this, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Pretty commonly known thing there, that Peter just makes this wonderful spirit-filled proclamation, and what happens? Jesus calls him saved. Man, the human condition turns us around real quick, doesn't it? He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels." Okay, so that finishes up the gospel. We kind of have three little sections. We have the proclamation of Jesus as Messiah, straight from the mouth of Peter. We have Jesus' announcement of yes, and this is what it means, and Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus turns around and rebukes him right back. And then we have an address to all the crowds as Jesus talks and once again teaches this is what a life of discipleship is. It's not easy. It's not always positive. It's not always fulfilling, but it involves hardships. It involves a lot. It may involve death for those in the first century. For a lot of them, it quite literally meant death and martyrdom. Maybe that's what he was saying with take up your cross. But what could that be? There's a lot of times focus on this of what is your cross? What is your cross to bear? What is the suffering that you must undergo? And if you don't, it means you're not a Christian. Well, sometimes I find that intriguing, and sometimes that just annoys me. But what is to say that that cross means? And for me, as I think about it, I think about something called the theology of the cross, which was something presented by Martin Luther. Of course, expanded since then. But the theology of the cross calls something what it is. The cross is a horrible, painful death perfected by the Romans as a method of not only torture for the individual, but as a sign of this is what's going to happen to you if you rise up against us. So they did it right along the road. They did it very publicly. It was a public, humiliating, torturous, long, drawn-out death. And we call that the point where God meets us. That God is willing to go to any length and endured the cross to prove it. But we call that what it is. We don't call the cross a wonderful thing. The cross is a horrible thing. It's a horrific thing that our Lord would endure that on our behalf. But yet that's the reality of it. And theology of the cross says we call something what it is. If something's bad, we acknowledge it. And we don't discount it. We don't say, well, we don't deny it. We call something what it is, and we recognize that we have a God that loves us enough to wade through that junk with us, whatever it is, whatever the hard stuff is. And maybe that's what that cross to bear is, acknowledging that life is hard, but that we are not alone in it, and that we have a God who has experienced it as well. That's kind of a lot of what's going on in this passage. It's one that we actually had fairly recently. It popped up back in Lent, which was 3-4 months ago. So we've had this same passage, not in the too distant past. I'll see if I can find a link to that particular video if you're interested in seeing that one as well. You can check that out. So that's kind of what's going on in this passage now here as we are moving through the season of Pentecost and getting towards the end of it. We will begin to see a shifted focus of our texts into more of what they call the apocalyptic, and looking into the future, looking towards the end times, which will occur at some unknown time. But we're kind of shifting our focus that way, of moving past the life and the ministry of Jesus more towards now what is to come. So as we move towards the end of the season of Pentecost and into the new church year of Advent, though that won't be until late November. So we got a couple of months yet. If you have any thoughts or questions or comments on this text, things that have come up for you, notions that you have, ideas you have, please share those down in the comment section. always do love to hear from you when those show up, and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week and God bless.